I wasn't going to let anyone in. I'd made that decision somewhere between the second winter without her in the morning. My daughter asked me why I still set 2 coffee mugs out on the counter every day. I didn't have an answer for that. I just quietly put one back in the cabinet and told myself that was enough of a decision for one day. My name is Scott, and I drive a snowplow for the city of Ottawa. Have for 11 years. Before that, I did road maintenance. Before that, I worked a loading dock in Nepean. I'm not telling you this because it matters what I do. I'm telling you because it explains a certain kind of life. The kind where you're up at 4 in the morning when the rest of the city is still asleep, where you eat lunch in the cab of a truck, where your hands are always a little rough no matter how much lotion your daughter puts on them. Because she read somewhere that working men don't take care of their skin, and she's been trying to fix that about me since she was 9 years old. Her name is June. She was 12 when this story starts. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of going completely still when something was bothering her, which meant I spent most of her childhood learning to read very small signals. A certain quiet at dinner, the way she'd fold her napkin into smaller and smaller squares when she was upset about something at school. I got good at it. You have to, when there's only one of you and the thing you love most in the world is counting on you to notice. It was a Tuesday in late October when I first saw them. I was finishing a pothole repair on Island Park Drive. Not a plow day, just regular crew work. And the temperature had dropped faster than the forecast said it would. I remember because I'd left my good gloves in the truck, and I was working with the thin ones, and my hands were aching by 11. The kind of ache that goes up into your wrists. There was a café on the corner. One of those places with the big windows and the wood tables, and the little paper cups of brown sugar on the saucers. I'd walked past it 100 times, never gone in. Not really the kind of place I go into. But my hands were hurting and I had 12 minutes before we had to pack up, so I went in. She was sitting at the table nearest the window and she was crying. Not dramatically, not in the way that makes people look. Quietly. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, and her coffee had gone cold, and she was just sitting there with tears running down her face, like she didn't even know they were happening. There was a little girl beside her, maybe 6 or 7 years old, and the little girl was watching her mother with this expression I recognized. The expression of a child who wants to fix something they don't have the tools to fix yet. She had her small hand over her mother's hand and she wasn't saying anything, just holding on. I didn't mean to stare. I ordered my coffee and I stood by the counter and I looked out the window instead. When I turned back to wait, the little girl caught my eye. She didn't smile. She just looked at me with this very serious face, like she was assessing something. Then she looked back at her mother. I left without saying anything. Of course I did. You don't walk up to a stranger who's crying in a cafe and say anything. That's not how it works. I got back to the truck and I put my thin gloves back on, and I worked the rest of the afternoon with cold hands, and I didn't think about it much after that, except I did. I thought about it the whole drive home. I found out her name 3 weeks later, in a way that had nothing to do with me trying to find it out. June's school did this thing in November, a fundraiser, a dinner auction at a hotel downtown. The kind of event I normally found a polite reason to avoid. But June's class was doing a performance, and she'd been practicing a recorder piece for 6 weeks, and there was no version of the universe in which I wasn't going to be there for that. I wore my good jacket, the navy one I'd bought for my sister's wedding 4 years ago that still fit, barely. I got there early, found a seat near the back because June had told me not to embarrass her by sitting in the front, and I read the program 3 times because I didn't know anyone else at the table, and there's only so long you can stare at your hands. The woman who sat down across from me 20 minutes later was the one from the cafe. She wasn't crying this time. She was in a dark green dress and her hair was up, and she was talking quietly on her phone with that particular tone of someone dealing with something professional and unpleasant. She sat down without looking up. She finished the call. She set her phone face down on the table, and then she exhaled through her nose. Just slowly, just once, the way people do when they're holding more than they're letting anyone see. Then she looked up and found me looking at her, and I looked immediately at my program. "Do you actually know what time the student portion starts?" she said. "Or are you also just guessing it's probably after the speeches?" "I'm guessing," I said. My daughter said 7:30, but she also told me to sit in the back, so I'm operating on limited intelligence here. That got a small smile. Mine said the same thing about the back. Her name was Christine Okafor. I found that out from the program. She was listed as one of the event's major sponsors, which should have told me something right away. But honestly, I wasn't paying attention to the sponsor list. I was just glad to have someone to talk to before the speeches started. We talked through the salad course, mostly about the kids. Hers was 8, a girl named Bea, short for Beatrix, and it was Bea's class doing the recorder piece along with June's. Christine had moved to Ottawa from Toronto 14 months ago, she said, and the city still didn't quite feel like hers. She said it the way people say things when they're surprising themselves by saying them out loud. A little careful, like she was checking whether the words were accurate even as they came out. "Do you like it?" I asked. "Ottawa. It's quieter," she said. "Then Toronto. Then everything." I thought about asking what she meant by that. I didn't. The speeches started and we stopped talking, and I spent the next 45 minutes watching a man in a suit describe a capital campaign I didn't understand while trying not to fall asleep, in a way that June would later be able to describe to her friends. When the kids came out, I forgot about all of it. June was in the 3rd row, and she played her recorder with the focused intensity she brought to everything, her chin slightly down, and I sat in the back of that hotel ballroom and felt the particular specific pride of a parent watching their child do something ordinary and finding it completely extraordinary. I didn't look over at Christine, but at some point during the performance, I became aware that she was crying again. Not the way she had been in the café, just quietly, watching her daughter play. Afterward, in the lobby, Bea found June before either of the adults found either of the kids. I don't know how children do this, locate each other in crowded rooms the way they do. But they were already talking when Christine and I arrived, and Bea was showing June something on her sleeve, a small embroidered patch, and June was nodding very seriously, like she was being given important information. Christine looked at me, and I looked at Christine, and we both had that particular helpless expression that parents get when their children have decided something without asking. "I guess they know each other," Christine said. "Mine talks to everyone," I said. "I take no credit." Bea looked up at that moment and looked directly at me. She had the same still, assessing quality I'd noticed in the cafe. Like she was running some kind of internal calculation that adults weren't allowed access to. She tugged on Christine's sleeve. "He's the one," she said. Christine went absolutely still. "The one what?" I said, because I didn't know enough to be cautious yet. "The one from the window," Bea said, "when you were sad." He was the one who was looking out the window and didn't stare. I remembered then how I'd looked away, how I'd deliberately looked out the window when I'd caught myself watching. I hadn't realized a 7-year-old had clocked that. Christine's face did something complicated that I wasn't meant to see. She looked at her daughter, and then at me, and then at her daughter again. "We should get your coat," she said to Bea. "His daughter's name is June," Bea said, ignoring this entirely. "I already asked. I want to tell you that things moved quickly after that, because that's the easier version of the story. But the truth is they didn't. The truth is Christine Okafor was a woman with very good reasons to be careful, and I was a man with very good reasons to stay in the lane I'd been in for 4 years. And between the two of us, we managed to not call each other for 3 weeks after she gave me her number in the parking lot. She texted first, a Saturday morning in December. It just said, "Bea wants to know if June likes skating." I showed it to June, who said, obviously without looking up from her book, and I took that as a yes. We went to the Rideau Canal, all 4 of us. The girls skated ahead, and Christine and I walked on the ice slowly, the way you do when you're not entirely sure what you're doing there, but you don't want to say so. And she told me about her company. I knew the name, Okafor and Cross, which was one of those property development companies whose signs I'd driven past on construction sites without ever thinking about who was behind them. She'd co-founded it at 31. Her business partner and co-founder had died of a heart attack in the spring, which is what had brought her to Ottawa. Restructuring, she said, though I could hear what that word was covering. She'd been running the company alone since April. She had a board of directors who didn't entirely trust her judgment, investors who called her office 3 times a week, and a daughter who had stopped sleeping through the night after the move and had only recently started again. "I don't know why I'm telling you all of this," she said. "Because we're walking slowly on ice and there's nowhere to go," I said. She laughed, actually laughed, and ahead of us, Spia looked back over her shoulder at the sound. "I want to stop here for a moment, because I want to get this right." I knew what Christine was, and I mean that in the most practical sense. She was the kind of person whose decisions got reported in the business section. She had a house in Rockcliffe Park. I dropped them home that day and tried not to look too long at the driveway. She had a legal team and an assistant who apparently guarded her calendar like it was a government document, and I had a semi-detached on the east side, a truck with 160,000 kilometers on it, and a retirement plan that I was honestly a little behind on. I wasn't embarrassed by any of that. I want to be clear about that. I've worked hard for everything I have, and I've never once been ashamed of how I make a living. But I was aware of the shape of things. I was aware that a woman like Christine could look at a man like me and do the math that people do, and I didn't particularly want to be on the wrong side of that math, so I kept things simple. We took the girls skating twice more in December. We got coffee once, just the two of us, on a Wednesday afternoon when June was at her grandmother's and Bea was at an after-school program. It was 40 minutes. We talked about the canal expansion and the ice conditions, and a book she was reading about urban planning in the 90s that she was using to think through a project, and when I told her about the drainage issues we'd been dealing with on a particular stretch of road, she actually leaned forward and said, "What kind of drainage failure, specifically?" Like it was interesting to her, and it took me a moment to understand that it was. I walked back to my truck in the December cold, and I sat there for a few minutes with the heater running, and I thought, this is a woman who asks follow-up questions. That's all I thought. I told myself that was not enough of a reason to complicate anything. It was Bea who complicated it. Christine told me later, months later, what had been happening on her end of things since October. And I'll tell you, because she said I could, because she said the thing that changed everything deserves to be told accurately. Christine had been under a particular kind of pressure since her partner's death. The board wanted her to bring in a co-chair. Several of them had candidates in mind, men, mostly, from the development world, with the right kind of credentials and the right kind of connections. There were dinners. There were introductions at events. Christine was not naive about what the subtext of these introductions was. She was 42, and she was running a company alone, and some of the people around her had decided, without asking, that what she needed was a particular kind of man to stand next to her. She told me she'd started dreading her own calendar, that she'd go through a week of exactly the right meetings and dinners, and come home and sit on the edge of Bee's bed, and feel absolutely nothing, like someone had taken the part of herself that knew how to want things and put it somewhere she couldn't reach. She'd talked to Bea about it once, not directly, just vaguely about how sometimes grown-ups had to spend time with people they didn't know, and Bea had said, "Do any of them see you?" Christine had thought she misunderstood. "What do you mean, see me?" "Like," Bea said, and she'd apparently struggled to explain it, like the way you can tell when someone is looking at you versus when someone is looking at what you have. She was 8 years old. Christine said she hadn't been able to answer. She'd said goodnight and turned off the light and stood in the hallway for a long time. That was in January, and in January, Christine told her assistant to clear 2 consecutive Saturdays. Not for meetings, not for events, just to be with Bea. And on the first of those Saturdays, Bea had asked to go skating on the canal, and Christine had texted me, and the rest of that part of the story you already know. What I didn't know until March was that Bea had been watching me, specifically. All those afternoons, all those canal visits and drop-offs, and the one Wednesday coffee. Watching the way I talked to Christine, not performing anything, not trying to be impressive, just talking. Watching the way I talked to Bea herself, which was the way I talked to everyone, which is directly and without making it weird. In March, Christine sat me down. This was before things had become anything official, before we'd even said the word relationship out loud. And she was nervous in a way I hadn't seen her be nervous before, and she said there was something she wanted to tell me, but that she wanted to explain the context first. She'd made a decision, she said, sometime in February, about the pressure she was under, about the introductions and the dinners and the board and all of it. She'd decided that she was not going to make any decision about her personal life for anyone else's reasons. That if she brought someone into her life, into Bea's life, it would be because Bea felt it. Because Bea said so. She'd been watching her daughter make better calls about people in 6 months than Christine had made in the past 5 years, and she was going to trust that. She looked at me across her kitchen table with the March light coming in through the window, and she said, "I told Bea that," and Bea said she already knew. I didn't understand at first. Knew what? Christine said. She said, "Mom, it's Scott. It's already Scott." I sat with that for a moment. "She's 8, I said. "I know. Does she know what she's saying?" Christine looked at me in the particular way that people look at you when they think you might be underestimating something. She said, and I'm quoting her exactly here, "He looked away when you were sad. He didn't look to see. He just didn't want you to feel looked at." I had to put my coffee down. I hadn't known anyone notice that. I genuinely hadn't known. I'd looked away in that cafe because it felt like the decent thing to do. Because a woman crying quietly in a window deserves not to be watched. And it had not occurred to me that it meant anything at all. It had not occurred to me that a 7-year-old was logging it somewhere in whatever system she used to track people. But she had. I want to be honest with you about the next part, because I think the honest version matters more than the clean version. I was scared, not of Christine, not of who she was or what she had, or the gap between her world and mine. I'd made my peace with that, more or less. I was scared of the other thing, the thing I hadn't let myself think about too directly since I'd put that second coffee mug back in the cabinet. I called my sister that night, Lynn, who lives in Canada, who has known me since before I could spell my own name, who will not let me get away with any version of myself that isn't accurate. I told her what Christine had said. I told her what Bea had said. Lynn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Scott, you've been setting one mug out for 4 years. 1. I know. June asked me about it last month. Whether you were okay, I hadn't known that." "She's 12, Lynn said. "She knows exactly what you're doing. She's just waiting for you to stop." I didn't say anything. "The little girl's name is Bea," Lynn said. "And she's 8 years old and she already trusts you. That doesn't happen. That doesn't just happen." I went home that night and June was still up, which she technically wasn't supposed to be at 11 on a Thursday, but I didn't say anything about it. I sat down next to her on the couch, and she leaned against my shoulder without looking away from her book, the way she'd done since she was small. And I thought about how I'd spent 4 years making sure she was okay, how I'd learned to read napkin folding and coffee mug arrangements and small silences, how I'd gotten so good at watching for other people's signals that I'd stopped noticing my own. "June," I said. Do you like Bea?" She turned to Paige. "Yeah, she's weird but in a good way. Okay, is this about Christine?" I looked at the side of her face. Maybe. June closed her book. This was significant. June does not close books mid-chapter. She looked at me and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's stillness and she said, "Dad, I've been watching you be okay for 4 years. You can be something else now." I don't have words for what that does to a person. When your 12-year-old daughter, who has been folding her napkin into smaller and smaller squares since she was old enough to be worried about you, looks at you and tells you that she's ready, that she's been ready, that she has been waiting for you to give yourself permission. I didn't cry in front of her. I have my limits. But it was close. Christine and I had dinner the following Saturday. Just the two of us, the girls at their respective grandparents', a small Italian place in the glebe that Christine had been to before and I hadn't. I told her what June had said. She told me about a conversation she'd had with Bea the same week, in which Bea had apparently asked whether she could have a room at our house for when I stay over, which Christine noted was a logistical assumption that no one had technically confirmed yet. We sat there with our pasta getting cold and laughed about this for longer than was probably dignified. Then Christine said, "I need to ask you something. Okay, all those dinners, all those introductions. I never felt any of it. I kept waiting to feel something and I just didn't. And I thought maybe I was broken, or maybe I'd been running so fast for so long that I'd lost the part of me that knows how to want things." "And now," I said. She picked up her fork. "Put it back down. I want to know what kind of gloves you're going to get for next winter," she said. "I want to know if June's recorder concert is in June or May. I want to know what your hands look like in 20 years. I thought about that for a moment. About the thin gloves and the cold morning on Island Park Drive. About how I'd walked into a café with aching hands and hadn't said a single word to anyone, and somehow it had mattered anyway. Thicker gloves, I said. Definitely thicker. She smiled, actually smiled, the real one, not the careful version. I'm not going to tell you it was easy after that, because it wasn't. The board was a whole thing. Christine's decision to let her personal life be her own business sat differently with different people, and there were some uncomfortable months in the spring where I could tell she was absorbing pressure I was only getting secondhand reports of. I offered, more than once, to make things simpler for her. She told me, more than once, that the last thing she needed from me was another person making decisions based on what they thought was easier for her. We moved slowly. We took the girls skiing in Gatineau in February. We spent Easter with Lynn, which was the first time I'd brought anyone to a family thing in 4 years. And Lynn had prepared by making an amount of food that suggested she'd been waiting to do this for some time. Bea ate 3 pieces of butter tart and told Lynn they were the best thing she'd ever had, which means Bea is welcome at any Doherty family gathering for the rest of her life. June and Bea have worked out their own arrangement, which mostly involves June deciding things, and Bea assessing whether June's decisions meet her standards. It works, somehow. It works in the specific way that things work when 2 kids have decided to be sisters without waiting for anyone to give them permission. Last week, I was changing the oil on my truck in the driveway on a Saturday morning, which is something I do myself because I am not paying the dealership what they charge. And Bea came outside in her coat and rubber boots and stood there watching me for a while. "You're good at that," she said. "Takes about 20 minutes if you know what you're doing," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know what I told my mom that time?" "Which time?" "In the café," she said, "when you looked away." I stopped what I was doing. I told her, Bea said, that most people look harder when someone's sad, like they want to see it. But you looked at the window. I looked at this 8-year-old girl in her rubber boots standing in my driveway on a cold Saturday morning. I didn't want her to feel watched, I said. Bea nodded, like this confirmed something she'd already known. "That's what I told her," she said. "I said that meant you were safe." She went back inside then, and I sat there on the driveway with oil on my hands and the November cold coming in under my jacket, and I thought about all the small decisions a person makes without knowing they're being watched. All the moments you don't perform anything because you don't think anyone's keeping score. I thought about the café, and the thin gloves, and June's napkin squares, and the second coffee mug I used to put out every morning because some part of me wasn't ready to stop. And I thought, the realest things that ever happened to me happened when I wasn't trying to make anything happen. I don't know if that's something you can teach. I think it might just be the way it is. You can't practice being safe for someone. You either are or you aren't, and the people who need to know will find out, sooner or later, even if they're 8 years old and standing in a cafe window with their hand over their mother's hand. I'm Scott Doherty. I drive a snowplow for the city of Ottawa. I have a daughter named June, who folds napkins when she's worried and closes books mid-chapter, only when something matters. And there is a woman named Christine, and a girl named Bea, who made a decision before any of the adults were ready to, and all 3 of them have made my life into something I didn't know I was still allowed to have. That's the whole of it, and it's more than enough.